Hey guys, welcome to RES Stories. I watched a $40 million clubhouse crumble in 48 hours as federal agents seized the property. The HOA president tried to steal my legacy with fake fines, thinking her connections made her untouchable. She didn't know I held the original homestead deed from 1887, proving she was trespassing on my 3,000 acres. Instead of evicting me, she left in handcuffs while I exposed her illegal empire. They messed with the wrong forensic surveyor. Here is the story. The Wyoming wind carries a specific grit to it, a fine silica dust that settles into the pores of your skin and the mechanical joints of your equipment if you are not careful. It's a landscape that doesn't forgive mistakes, and it certainly doesn't tolerate arrogance. I was standing in the shadow of the Absaroka Range, wiping down the lens of a military-grade LiDAR scanner with an oiled cloth, when the intrusion began. It wasn't the sound of nature, the call of a red-tailed hawk, or the rustle of lodgepole pine, but the aggressive, high-pitched whine of a supercharged engine clawing its way up my gravel drive. I didn't turn around immediately. My focus remained on the calibration of the brass theodolite mounted on the hood of my truck. It was a tool that had belonged to my grandfather, heavy, precise, and devoid of the digital drift that plagues modern equipment. It held a truer line than most people's moral compasses. The vehicle crunched to a halt directly behind me, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from its engine block. The smell of hot brakes and unburnt fuel invaded the clean scent of sagebrush. I finished wiping the lens, capped it with deliberate slowness, and finally turned to face the disturbance. It was a white Mercedes G-Wagon, pristine and gleaming, looking entirely out of place against the backdrop of rugged timber and dust. It looked less like a vehicle and more like a jewelry box on wheels. The driver's door opened, and a woman stepped out. She was a study in manufactured perfection, encased in a light blue power suit that looked stiff enough to crack if she bent her elbows too quickly. Her hair was a helmet of blonde lacquer, immovable in the mountain breeze, and her face was set in an expression of permanent, disdainful judgment. Meredith Thornfield. I didn't know her name yet, but I knew her type. I had seen 1,000 versions of her in courtrooms and deposition halls across the country. People who believed the world was a product to be consumed, and that anyone standing in their way was merely a defective unit to be returned. She didn't speak at first. Instead, she walked to the front of my truck, a mud-caked Ford F-150 that had seen more job sites than paved roads, and she tapped the hood. She was holding a graphite golf club, and she used the head of it to strike the metal of my vehicle. Tap, tap, tap. It was a rhythmic, calculated insult, a physical violation of personal space designed to provoke a reaction. She treated the truck like a dead animal she was poking with a stick. You actually think inheriting this pile of dirt gives you a seat at our table? Her voice cut through the crisp air like a diamond-tipped saw, devoid of warmth or humanity. Move this junk, or I'll have it compacted into a cube with you still inside. I looked at the golf club, then up to her eyes. She was waiting for me to apologize. She was waiting for me to stammer, to explain that I was just passing through, to acknowledge her superiority. She saw the fraying collar of my canvas jacket, the 3 days of stubble on my face, and the mud on my boots, and she categorized me as debris. To her, I was a squatter, or perhaps a distant, down-on-his-luck nephew of the previous owner, looking for a handout. I wasn't aware the county landfill offered valet service, I said, my voice low and steady. Or are you lost? Meredith's lip curled, a spasm of annoyance cracking her porcelain mask. She reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a thick, folded document. She crumpled it in her fist, reducing the legal paperwork to a ball of trash, and tossed it through the open window of my truck. It landed on the passenger seat with a soft thud. "That is a citation for $50,000, she said, dusting her hands off as if she had touched something filthy. "Blight violations, unauthorized vehicle storage, visual pollution. You have 48 hours to vacate my viewshed. If you are still here on Friday, I will have my crew bulldoze that rotting cabin, and I will bill you for the demolition costs." I looked at the crumpled paper, then back at her. "Your viewshed." "The Emerald Waters Estates," she declared, gesturing vaguely toward the east, where the trees thinned out. "We maintain standards. We maintain property values. And we do not tolerate trash on our periphery. This land is a buffer zone, nothing more. And you are trespassing on our patience." She stepped closer, invading my personal space, the smell of expensive perfume clashing violently with the scent of pine and diesel. "Go back to whatever hole you crawled out of. This represents progress. You represent the past, and the past always gets buried." She spun on her designer heels, the movement stiff with rage, and marched back to her G-Wagon. She slammed the door, the sound echoing like a gunshot across the valley, and reversed aggressively, spraying gravel onto my boots before tearing back down the drive. I watched her go, standing motionless in the dust cloud she left behind. She thought she had intimidated me. She thought she had delivered a crushing blow. What she didn't know was that I wasn't just looking at her car. I was looking at the fence line she had left open behind her. I spent 15 years as a federal forensic surveyor. My job wasn't to dig ditches. It was to drop into the middle of range wars between billionaires and the government, armed with historical archives and satellite telemetry, to prove exactly where a line was drawn 100 years ago. I see the world in vectors, in elevation gradients, and in longitudinal coordinates precise to the millimeter. And even without my equipment running, I could tell just by the angle of her departure that the fence line of the Emerald Waters Estates was geometrically impossible. I reached into the truck and picked up the crumpled citation. $50,000. It wasn't a fine. It was an act of war. I smoothed the paper out on the hood of the truck. It was on letterhead that looked official enough to fool a layman, listing statutes and bylaws that likely didn't exist. I folded it neatly and placed it in my breast pocket. Uncle Calloway had warned me about the sharks circling the ranch. He had left me this land not because I was the favorite nephew, but because I was the only one who knew how to hunt sharks. I climbed into the truck and shifted it into gear. The cabin was 3 miles in, tucked away from the main road in a box canyon that shielded it from the wind and the prying eyes of the modern world. As I drove, the tension in my shoulders began to harden into resolve. The landscape here was rugged, unforgiving, and beautiful in a way that demanded respect. It was sagebrush seas and granite cathedrals, a place where the silence had weight. My family had stewarded this land since 1887, long before luxury SUVs and homeowners associations existed. The cabin appeared around the final bend, a structure of rough-hewn logs and stone that seemed to grow out of the earth itself. It smelled of cedar smoke and memories. I parked the truck and began hauling my gear inside. These weren't suitcases of clothes. They were heavy, reinforced pelican cases containing the tools of my trade. I set them on the heavy oak table in the center of the main room, sweeping aside a layer of dust that had accumulated since Calloway's passing. I opened the first case. Inside lay the LiDAR scanner, a device capable of mapping topography through dense canopy cover, creating a 3-dimensional wireframe of the Earth. Next to it, I placed my laptop, a ruggedized field unit loaded with GIS software and historical satellite imagery. I wasn't here to relax. I wasn't here to mourn. I was here to work. I booted up the system and pulled up the satellite overlay of the region. The screen filled with the deep greens and browns of the Wyoming wilderness. The Cross Ranch was a massive, irregular shape, a green void on the map where development had not yet reached. But as I scrolled to the eastern sector, the border Meredith had come from, the green stopped abruptly. It was replaced by a gray, geometric cancer, the Emerald Waters Estates. From the satellite view, it looked like a fortress, manicured fairways, winding paved roads, and rooftops that sprawled with excessive square footage. It pressed right up against my property line, a wall of development shoving against the wilderness. But as I zoomed in, looking at the interface between their land and mine, the feeling in my gut intensified. The curvature of their shoreline road didn't match the natural topography of the valley floor. The placement of their perimeter fence ignored the watershed trajectory. In my line of work, nature dictates boundaries. Rivers, ridges, drainage basins. When a property line ignores nature, it usually means someone is lying. I needed eyes on the ground. I grabbed my keys and the high-resolution DSLR camera with the telephoto lens. The drive to the eastern boundary took 20 minutes over fire roads that hadn't seen a grader in a decade. As the dense pine forest began to thin, the world shifted abruptly. One moment, I was surrounded by wild sagebrush and ancient Douglas firs. The next, I was staring at a white vinyl fence so bright it hurt my eyes. Beyond it lay a world that looked like it had been sanitized for television. The grass was a chemically enhanced shade of green that didn't exist in nature. And there, sitting right on the edge of the lake, my lake, or at least the lake my family had protected for a century, was a structure that made my blood run cold. It was a clubhouse. That was a polite word for it. It was a sprawling neoclassical monstrosity with white pillars, a wraparound veranda, and a massive dock system that jutted 100 yards out into the deep water. Dozens of boats were moored there, expensive fiberglass hulls bobbing gently in the afternoon sun. Jet skis buzzed across the surface like angry hornets, carving white scars into the blue water. This wasn't just a neighbor building a shed too close to the line. This was an invasion. They hadn't just built near the water. They had claimed it. They had commodified it. I stepped out of the truck, my boots sinking into the soft loam on my side of the vinyl fence. I raised my camera and snapped a picture of the dock. Then I took a picture of the clubhouse foundation, then the manicured path leading from their development directly into my woods, marked with a sign that read, "Private Nature Trail, Residents Only." "You!" The shout came from a golf cart speeding toward me from the clubhouse. Two men in tactical vests that looked ridiculous over their polo shirts jumped out before the cart had even fully stopped. Private security. Rent-a-cops with a badge and a complex. Meredith was right behind them, emerging from the clubhouse like she'd been waiting for this moment. She walked past her security detail, waving them back with a dismissive flick of her wrist. She wanted this kill for herself. "I thought I made myself clear at the gate," Meredith said, stopping 10 feet away, safely on her side of the white vinyl line. "You are trespassing on the Emerald Waters maintenance easement. And that vehicle," she gestured vaguely at my truck with a look of pure disgust, "is a visual pollutant. We have standards here. Bylaws. Class A violations for unsightly machinery within view of the clubhouse." "I'm not on your easement," I said, my voice low and steady. It was the first time I'd really spoken to her face to face. "I'm on the Cross family ranch, and unless you have a warrant or a survey crew in your back pocket, I suggest you lower your voice." Meredith laughed. It was a dry, brittle sound, like dead leaves skittering on pavement. "The Cross Family Ranch? You mean this abandoned buffer zone? Honey, we've been maintaining this strip for 15 years. We mow it. We patrol it. We own it by adverse possession, if not by deed. But that's legal talk, and I doubt you understand it." She pulled another thick envelope from her blazer pocket and slapped it against the vinyl fence post. "This is a cease and desist and a bill. You're damaging our viewshed. You're lowering our property values just by existing. $500 for the first infraction. It doubles every day you remain visible." She stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "And that lake, don't even think about putting a line in it. That is a community amenity. Private property of the Emerald Waters HOA. If I see you on that water, I won't call the sheriff. I'll have your truck impounded and sold for scrap to pay your fines." I looked at the envelope. Then I looked at the dock. I looked at the way the pylons were driven deep into the lakebed. I pulled out my phone and opened the voice recorder app, ensuring the screen was visible but not obvious. "Just for the record," I said, "are you stating that the Emerald Waters HOA claims ownership of the lake surface and the shoreline extending to this fence?" "We don't claim it. We own it," Meredith sneered, leaning in toward the phone, her arrogance blinding her to the trap. "We built the dock. We stocked the fish. We patrol the water. It is ours. Now take your trash and get out of my sight." I didn't argue. I didn't scream. I didn't tell her that adverse possession requires open and notorious occupation for 20 years in Wyoming, not 15, and it absolutely does not apply to federal land grants. I just nodded. A slow, measured movement. I took the envelope from the fence post. "Noted," I said. I turned and walked back to the truck. As I drove away, I watched in the rearview mirror as she dusted her hands off, as if simply interacting with me had soiled them. She thought she had won. She thought she had crushed a bug. She had no idea she had just confessed to federal land fraud on a digital recording. Night fell heavy over the ranch. The darkness out here is different. It has weight. I sat in the center of the cabin's main room, the only light coming from a lantern on the table. I had pried up the floorboards in the corner of the bedroom, acting on a memory from when I was 10 years old. Uncle Calloway used to hide his good whiskey and better papers down there. The whiskey was gone, consumed by the long, lonely winters, but the metal lockbox was still there, cool to the touch and heavy with potential. I cracked the combination, my grandfather's birthday, and the lid creaked open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth to keep out the moisture, was a stack of documents that smelled of history. I bypassed the standard deeds and tax records. I was looking for the origin point, the bedrock. And there it was. An original homestead title dated 1887, signed by Grover Cleveland. In the world of property law, a primary federal grant is the nuclear option. It is the highest form of land ownership in the United States. It isn't a transfer of title from one person to another. It is the original grant from the sovereign government to a citizen. And unlike modern deeds, which are often riddled with easements and restrictions, a title from that era often conveyed everything: mineral rights, timber rights, and crucially, water rights. I unfolded the parchment carefully. The calligraphy was faded but legible. I grabbed my magnifying glass and scanned the legal description. Section 14, Township 4 North, Range 7 West, including all bodies of water, riparian rights, and submerged lands therein contained. My heart hammered against my ribs. In most modern property laws, Navigable bodies of water are held in public trust. You can own the land up to the high water mark, but the state owns the water and the lakebed. But this title predated statehood statutes. It predated modern environmental regulations. It granted absolute fee simple title to the entire lake. The water wasn't a community amenity. It wasn't public property. It was private property. My private property. But that wasn't the only thing in the box. Beneath the title was a set of hand-drawn survey maps from 1962, commissioned by Callaway when the first developers started sniffing around the valley. I spread the map out over the table and overlaid it with the modern satellite printout I'd marked up. The discrepancy was subtle at first, but to my eyes, it was as glaring as a neon sign in a monastery. The Emerald Waters Clubhouse wasn't just near the line. The entire eastern wing, the commercial kitchen, and the massive septic system required to service it were sitting fully 300 feet inside the cross-family boundary. They hadn't just built on their land. They had crossed the line, buried the markers, and built a monument to their own ego on stolen ground. And then I saw it. On the 1962 map, there was a notation in red ink. North Marsh, protected wetland, natural drainage. I cross-referenced this with the satellite image of the HOA complex. Their nature trail ran right through that marsh, but something didn't add up. A complex that size with 300 luxury homes and a clubhouse produces a massive amount of wastewater. The county records I had pulled earlier showed a small treatment plant on the south side, but it was rated for maybe 50 homes maximum. Where was the rest of it going? I grabbed my jacket and the FLIR thermal imaging camera from my gear case. It was 2 a.m., the perfect time for a walk. I hiked the ridgeline, keeping to the shadows of the tree line, moving silent and slow. The air was biting cold, but adrenaline kept me warm. When I reached the ridge overlooking the North Marsh, the area adjacent to the clubhouse, I turned on the thermal camera. The world turned into shades of blue and gray in the viewfinder. The trees were cold. The ground was cool. But cutting through the center of the marsh, leading directly from the back of the clubhouse toward the center of my wetlands, was a bright, angry streak of orange and red heat. The heat signature of decaying waste. They had buried a bypass pipe. To save money on a proper expansion of their treatment plant, they were pumping raw, untreated sewage and kitchen gray water directly into the marsh on my land. They were using my inheritance as their toilet. I lowered the camera, my hand trembling slightly, not from cold, but from a rage so cold and pure it felt like ice in my veins. This wasn't just trespassing. This was a violation of the Clean Water Act. It was a felony. It was environmental terrorism. Meredith Thornfield wasn't just a bully in a light blue suit. She was the head of a criminal enterprise. I hiked back to the cabin. The thermal images saved to 3 different encrypted drives. I didn't sleep. I brewed a pot of coffee black enough to float a horseshoe and sat on the porch, watching the sun rise over the lake that they were poisoning. The attack came at 8 a.m. sharp. I heard the rumble of heavy machinery before I saw it. A flatbed truck backing up to the main access road, the only road that connected my cabin to the highway. It was followed by a crane. I walked down the driveway, my coffee mug in hand, watching as the crane operator lowered 3 massive landscaping boulders directly across the entrance to my property. They were the size of small cars, immovable without heavy equipment. Meredith stood by the flatbed, arms crossed, looking triumphant. She wasn't alone this time. She had a man with her. Slick hair, expensive suit, holding a briefcase like it was a shield. "Good morning, neighbor." Meredith called out, her voice dripping with saccharine malice. "We're doing some landscaping improvements to the community entrance. We realized that this old dirt path was an eyesore, so we're closing it off. You can hike out if you want, but that truck isn't going anywhere." "This is a deeded easement," I said, stepping up to the boulders. "Blocking a recorded right-of-way is illegal." The lawyer stepped forward. "Actually, Mr. Cross, we reviewed the county records. The easement for this road expired upon the death of Callaway Cross. It was a personal easement, not a transferable one. As of this morning, you are landlocked." He opened his briefcase and handed me a thick stack of papers. "And furthermore, we are filing a lien against the property for the unpaid fines, which now total $50,000 due to the retroactive application of daily penalties for the last 10 years of blight. If you cannot pay, the HOA will begin foreclosure proceedings to seize the land for restitution." $50,000. They didn't just want me gone. They wanted to steal the land legally. They wanted to bankrupt me, force a sheriff's sale, and buy the ranch for pennies to expand their golf course. "You have 48 hours to vacate," Meredith said, checking her watch. "After that, we turn off the power at the junction box, which is conveniently on our side of the property line." I looked at the boulders. I looked at the lien notice. Then I looked at Meredith. "You're making a mistake," I said softly. "The only mistake," Meredith spat, stepping close enough that I could smell her expensive perfume masking the rot of her soul, "was your uncle thinking he could hold on to this prime real estate forever. It's over. You're done. Go back to whatever hole you crawled out of." She signaled the driver, and they drove off, leaving me trapped behind a wall of rock. I stood there for a long time, the morning sun glinting off the mica and the granite boulders that now imprisoned me. They had cut off my road. They had threatened my power. They had poisoned my land. And now, they were coming for the deed itself. I walked back to the cabin, the gravel crunching under my boots, sounding like bones breaking. I went inside and picked up the satellite phone. I sat at the table, the 1887 deed on one side, the thermal images of the sewage pipe on the other. Meredith thought she had trapped a rat. She thought she had sealed the exit and started the fumigation. I dialed a number I hadn't called in 3 years. A secure line to the Army Corps of Engineers. "Colonel Vance?" I said when the line clicked open. "It's Sterling. I need the Corps. We have a Class 1 environmental hazard in progress." "Sterling?" Vance's voice was sharp, alert. "Where are you?" "I'm in Wyoming," I said, my eyes fixed on the map where the red line of my property sliced right through Meredith's precious clubhouse. "And I'm going to need the marshals." I hung up the phone. I wasn't trapped. I was just digging in. The war had officially begun. The satellite phone clicked off, severing the connection to Colonel Vance. But the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was the heavy, pressurized silence of a fuse burning toward detonation. I didn't sleep. Sleep is a luxury for men who aren't currently imprisoned behind 3 tons of granite on their own land. Instead, I spent the remaining daylight hours preparing the kill box. I meticulously backed up every terabyte of LiDAR data and thermal imagery to 3 separate encrypted cloud servers. Then, I printed physical copies. Hard evidence doesn't glitch, and it doesn't get accidentally deleted by a magnetic pulse. I organized the files into a narrative arc that any federal prosecutor could read like a bedtime story. The deed, the encroachment, the pollution, the fraud. By the time the sun dipped below the Absaroka Range, painting the sky in bruises of purple and red, I had built a paper weapon capable of leveling an empire. Nightfall brought a drop in temperature and a shift in tactics. Meredith had blocked my vehicle, but she hadn't accounted for the fact that I had spent 15 years navigating terrain that would break a mountain goat. I dressed in matte black gear, strapped the data drives to my chest, and slipped out the back window of the cabin. I moved through the timber on foot, bypassing the main road and the boulders, navigating by the stars and memory. I needed one final piece of the puzzle. The thermal camera had proven the sewage leak, and the LiDAR had proven the encroachment. But to make the charges stick to Meredith personally, to ensure she didn't just pay a fine and walk away, I needed to prove she knew. I needed the financial link. I reached the edge of the Emerald Waters property line just after midnight. The clubhouse was dark, save for the security lights that bathed the white pillars in an artificial, ghostly glow. I wasn't heading for the clubhouse, though. I was heading for the small administrative annex tucked behind the tennis courts. According to the public blueprints I had pulled weeks ago, this was where the records were kept. But I didn't have to break in. As I approached the tree line bordering the parking lot, I saw a figure standing by a dumpster, shivering in the cold mountain air. It was a woman, clutching a thick file folder against her chest, as if it were a shield. I recognized her from the HOA website directory I had memorized. Ara Vance, the HOA treasurer. She looked terrified, casting glances over her shoulder at the looming clubhouse. I stepped out of the shadows, hands visible. "Miss Vance?" She jumped, nearly dropping the files. "Holy cow! You're the guy from the cabin, Sterling." "I am. Why are you out here at midnight, Ara?" "She's crazy," Ara whispered, her voice trembling. "Meredith, she told us tonight. She told the board that if you didn't leave by Friday, she was going to have the problem removed." She wasn't talking about legal eviction, Sterling. She was talking about fire. She said accidents happen in old wooden cabins all the time. My jaw tightened. Arson. Conspiracy to commit murder. Meredith wasn't just a white-collar criminal. She was a predator. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I cook the books," Ara blurted out, tears spilling onto her cheeks. "She makes me. The assessments, the fines, the beautification fees. Half of it doesn't go to the HOA accounts. It goes to a shell company in Nevada called Thornfield Developments. It's her husband's construction firm. They're funneling millions out of the community, Sterling. And now she wants to kill someone? I can't. I can't do it." She thrust the folder toward me. "Take it. It's everything. The wire transfers, the fake invoices for the dock repairs that never happened, the emails where she explicitly discusses the boundary line." She knew Sterling. She knew 15 years ago that the clubhouse was on your land. She wrote an email to her husband saying, "The old man will die soon, and nobody checks surveys in the wilderness." I took the folder. It felt heavy, not with paper, but with the weight of 15 years of deception. This was the nail in the coffin. "Go home, Ara," I said, my voice soft but intense. "Lock your doors. Call in sick tomorrow. Do not come to the clubhouse." "Why?" she asked, wiping her eyes. "Because tomorrow isn't a board meeting," I said, looking toward the dark windows of Meredith's office. "It's a federal raid." She fled into the night, and I slipped back into the timber. I had the map. I had the poison. And now I had the motive. The sun didn't rise the next morning. It unveiled the battlefield. At 8 a.m. sharp, the air in the valley changed. It wasn't the wind. It was the low-frequency thrum of heavy engines approaching in a synchronized column. I stood on the porch of my cabin, drinking black coffee, watching the dust plume rise from the access road. They didn't stop at the boulders. The lead vehicle, a heavy-duty loader bearing the seal of the U.S. Marshals Service, simply engaged its front bucket and pushed the 3-ton rocks aside like they were styrofoam packing peanuts. The screech of granite on steel echoed through the canyon, a violent announcement of arrival. Behind the plow came 4 black Chevrolet Suburbans with tinted windows and government plates. Following them was a white hazmat response unit and a flatbed truck carrying heavy demolition equipment. The convoy rolled up my driveway and halted in a precision formation. Colonel Vance stepped out of the lead SUV. He looked exactly as I remembered, square-jawed, efficient, a man who regarded bureaucracy as a minor annoyance to be crushed. Beside him stood a man in a windbreaker emblazoned with U.S. Marshal. "Sterling," Vance said, not bothering with a handshake. He looked at the cabin, then at the distant white fence of the HOA. "You weren't kidding about the encroachment. I pulled the satellite telemetry on the ride over. They didn't just cross the line, they annexed a sovereign kingdom." "Did you bring the hammer?" I asked. Vance nodded toward the marshal. "This is Deputy Marshal Higgins. He handles the wire fraud and the conspiracy. My team handles the water. And the EPA." He gestured to the hazmat team stepping out in protective gear. "They're here because you triggered a biological hazard protocol with those thermal scans. If that pipe is pumping what you say it is, this is the biggest environmental crime in the state's history." "Meredith is holding a victory gala at the clubhouse right now," I said, checking my watch. "She's celebrating the seizure of my land. She thinks she's won." Deputy Marshal Higgins adjusted his belt, the sun glinting off his badge. "Well," he said with a dry, dangerous smile, "it would be rude not to congratulate her." We didn't drive. We walked. There is a specific kind of terror induced by a column of federal agents moving on foot through the woods. It implies a lack of urgency that suggests total dominance. We moved through the trees, bypassing the manicured nature trail, heading straight for the sound of amplified self-congratulation. As we broke through the tree line, the scene that greeted us was grotesque in its luxury. The clubhouse lawn was set up with white tents and round tables. Waiters circulated with champagne flutes. 300 residents, the people Meredith had duped, fleeced, and lied to, were seated in rows, facing a stage where Meredith stood at a podium. She was radiant in her victory, wearing a fresh light blue suit, gesturing to a large concept artboard on an easel. "And once we remove the blight," she was saying, her voice amplified over the speakers, "we will expand the fairway right to the canyon edge. This assessment of $5,000 per family is a small price to pay for the exclusivity and security of emerald waters. We have crushed the threat. We have prevailed because we are the elite." The crowd applauded politely, though I noticed many of them looking at their phones or whispering. The unease was palpable. They were tired of the fees. They were tired of the bullying. I stepped out of the woods and onto the perfectly manicured grass. My boots were muddy. My jacket was torn. I looked like everything Meredith despised. Colonel Vance and Deputy Higgins flanked me, with 12 agents fanning out behind us in a silent, terrifying wedge. The applause died instantly. It started from the back and rolled forward like a wave of silence until the only sound was the hum of the PA system. Meredith looked up, annoyed at the interruption, squinting against the sun. When she saw me, her face twisted. "Security!" she shrieked into the microphone, the feedback whining. "Remove this trespasser! He is violating the restraining order!" 2 private security guards stepped forward, hands hovering near their tasers. "Federal agents!" Higgins' voice boomed across the lawn, not needing a microphone. "Stand down or be charged with obstruction of justice." The guards froze. They looked at the marshals, looked at the Army Corps insignia, and synchronized their decision to back away slowly with their hands raised. Meredith gripped the podium, her knuckles white. This is private property. You have no jurisdiction here. My husband is on the phone with the governor right now. The governor doesn't command the Army Corps of Engineers, Mrs. Thornfield, Vance said calmly as we ascended the stairs to the stage. I walked past her. I didn't even look at her. I went straight to the AV table where a young technician was trembling. "Plug this in," I said, handing him a ruggedized drive. He obeyed instantly. The concept art on the giant screen flickered and vanished. In its place, the high-resolution LiDAR scan of the valley appeared. It was a wireframe of truth, stripping away the trees and the buildings to show the naked earth. I took the microphone from the podium. Meredith tried to grab it, but Higgins stepped between us, a silent wall of federal authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice echoing over the water. "You've been told I'm a squatter. You've been told I'm trash. You've been told this land belongs to the HOA. I clicked the remote in my hand. A bright, burning red line slashed across the screen. This is the original boundary established in 1887. It has never moved. It has never been sold. The red line bisected the screen. It cut through the pool. It cut through the marina. And it cut directly through the middle of the clubhouse we were standing on. You are currently attending a party on private property, I said. My property. A gasp went through the crowd. Meredith's husband, a thick-necked man in a suit that cost more than my annual salary, lunged onto the stage. That's a lie. That map is a forgery. I surveyed this land myself. Then you missed the sewage pipe, I said. Click. The screen changed to a thermal video. The cold blue of the marsh and the bright, undeniable orange vein of raw waste pumping from the clubhouse foundation directly into the wetlands. For 15 years, I continued, instead of upgrading your septic system, the Thornfield Development Company has been pumping raw human waste into a federally protected waterway. That is a felony violation of the Clean Water Act, punishable by $50,000 per day per violation. I turned to the crowd. By my math, the liability hanging over this HOA right now is roughly $270 million. The silence shattered. People jumped to their feet. What? Is that true? Where is our money? I'll tell you where the money is, I said. Click. The screen filled with the documents Ara had given me. Bank transfers, shell companies. The emails prove Meredith's knowledge of the theft. Your beautification fees bought Mrs. Thornfield's G-Wagon. Your special assessments paid for her vacations to the Maldives. You haven't been paying for exclusivity. You've been paying for her lifestyle. Meredith let out a sound that wasn't quite human, a strangulated cry of rage and terror. She lunged at me, her fingernails hooked like talons. You ruined it, you filthy little... She never reached me. Deputy Higgins intercepted her with the casual grace of a man who dealt with violent offenders for a living. He spun her around and slammed her face first onto the podium she had just been preaching from. Meredith Thornfield, Higgins announced, his voice carrying over the screams of the crowd. You are under arrest for 18 counts of wire fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and major environmental crimes against the United States. You have the right to remain silent. The click of the handcuffs was the loudest sound in the valley. Her husband tried to run. He made it 3 steps before 2 EPA agents tackled him into the champagne tower. Glass shattered, sparkling in the sun like diamonds, mixing with the spilled alcohol on the deck that he had illegally built. Meredith was dragged down the stairs, kicking and screaming about her connections, about her status, about how this was impossible. The residents, her former subjects, parted like the Red Sea, holding up their phones, recording her downfall. There was no pity in their eyes, only the cold, hard realization that they had been played. As the squad cars drove Meredith and her husband away, a hush fell over the lawn. The adrenaline faded, replaced by a collective, crushing anxiety. A man in the front row, holding a toddler in his arms, stepped forward. He looked at the red line on the screen, then at his own house, which sat squarely inside the danger zone. "Mr. Cross," he said, his voice shaking, If you own the land, and the HOA is illegitimate, does that mean we're homeless? Are you going to bulldoze our houses?" I looked at him. I looked at the hundreds of faces staring up at me. Families, retirees, people who had bought into a lie, but had made a home out of it. Meredith had wanted to destroy my home to boost her portfolio. It would have been easy to do the same to them. It would have been legally justified. But that wasn't who the Cross family was. We weren't conquerors. We were stewards. "The clubhouse comes down," I said, pointing to the structure behind me. "The dock gets ripped out. The sewage pipe gets dug up and the wetlands get restored. The HOA pays for every cent of the remediation." I paused, looking at the man with the child. "But I'm not going to evict families who were conned. I don't want your houses. I want my land healed." I pulled a document from my jacket pocket, the lease agreement I had drafted the night before. "This is a 99-year land lease," I announced. "It grants every current homeowner the right to keep their home on its existing footprint. In exchange, the Emerald Waters HOA is dissolved effective immediately. A new conservation trust will manage the common grounds and the rent for the land under your homes." I let the sentence hang for a second. "Will be $1 per year, payable to the Cross Family Wildlife Fund." The man dropped to his knees. A woman behind him burst into tears. It wasn't cheering. It was the sound of a guillotine blade stopping an inch from their necks. They had expected a tyrant. They got a neighbor. The next 48 hours were a symphony of destruction. The Army Corps of Engineers didn't waste time. Heavy excavators tore into the clubhouse with a violence that felt righteous. I stood on my porch and watched as the white pillars crumbled, the roof collapsed, and the symbol of Meredith's arrogance was reduced to a pile of splintered wood and drywall. The EPA crews dug up the sewage pipe, sealing the breach and beginning the long process of flushing the toxins from the marsh. The dock was pulled from the water, piling by piling, returning the shoreline to its natural state. Meredith and her husband were denied bail. The flight risk was too high, given the millions they had stashed in offshore accounts, money the feds were already clawing back to pay for the cleanup. They were looking at 20 years, minimum. The Queen of the Valley would be trading her light blue suits for federal orange. 6 months later, the scars on the land had begun to heal. The invasive grass was gone, replaced by native wheatgrass and sage. The fence lines were down. I sat on the porch of my cabin as the sun began to set. The air was clean, smelling of pine and damp earth. There were no jet skis buzzing on the water, no high-pitched engines, just the call of a loon echoing off the glass, still surface of the lake. A truck crunched up the gravel drive. This time the gate was open. Colonel Vance stepped out, holding 2 cold beers. "Thought you might be thirsty," he said, handing me one. He leaned against the railing, looking out at the restored wetland. Red-winged blackbirds were already nesting in the reeds. "You did good work, Sterling," Vance said. "Most men would have taken the settlement check or burn the place down out of spite. The land doesn't care about spite, I said, taking a long sip. It just wants to breathe. You know, Vance chuckled, there's a legend growing at the agency. They call it the Cross Protocol. How to dismantle a $40 million fraud ring with a LiDAR scanner and a flashlight. It wasn't the scanner, I said. It was arrogance. They thought they could buy gravity. They forgot that water always flows downhill and the truth always floats. Vance finished his beer and pushed off the railing. Well, the Corps always has a spot for a man who can find a needle in a haystack, or a property line in a golf course. I think I'm done fighting, I said, looking at the spot where Uncle Calloway used to sit. I think I'm just going to be a neighbor. A grumpy one, sure, but a neighbor. Vance nodded and drove off, leaving me alone with the twilight. I walked down to the edge of the lake. The water was black and deep, reflecting the first stars of the evening. I watched an eagle circle overhead, its wingspan immense against the darkening sky. It dove, snatched a trout from the water, and wheeled away toward the mountains. Meredith had looked at this land and seen dollar signs. She saw a product. I looked at it and saw a responsibility. We don't own the land, we just borrow it from the future. The war was over. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of life. I turned back to the cabin, the warm yellow light in the window welcoming me home. They thought they could buy paradise. They forgot that you can only borrow it. If you enjoyed watching Justice Be Served, please leave a like, subscribe, and hit that thanks button to support more stories like this.
Thanks for staying to the end. Don't forget to like and subscribe to RES Stories.